Hey guys, it's GM Max here, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to play the very solid and safe Caro-Kann Defence with e4, c6, and d5 in just 10 variations, so that you can very easily remember the key moves and the key ideas, and be very successful playing this opening in your games with black. So let's begin. The main line for white, historically, is to play d4, d5, and now the move of knight to c3 is the old main line. And with the move knight to c3, basically white just wants to, after the move d takes e4 and knight takes e4, have a nice little space advantage with the pawn on d4. Now, one of the nice things about the Caro-Kann is that there's actually quite a few different ways in which you can play these positions. You can get your bishop outside the pawn chain with the move bishop to f5, also attacking the knight. And we can see that if we were to compare this position with a French defense where the black pawn, instead of being on c6, would be on e6, well, that would shut in our bishop on c8. But because we played the move c6 instead to support the d5 break, we don't have that problem and we can develop the bishop a lot more actively. Let's see a few more moves just so we can understand what black's general setup is from this point. So knight g3 is the standard move to not only defend the knight, but also attack the bishop on f5. We retreat with bishop to g6, keeping the bishop on a very nice active diagonal. If white goes h4, trying to harass our bishop, we play h6, making sure that we have a retreat square available if the bishop were to come under attack. White then normally plays knight to f3, not just to develop the knight, but also you do have to be careful of moves like knight to e5 going after the bishop. So the safe way to deal with that is just to play knight d7 and stop the move knight e5. White normally will play the move h5. For more advanced players watching this, it is worth pointing out that the move bishop d3 is actually considered now the more critical try at the highest level, but most of your opponents are going to play the move h5. And actually the nature of the position is not going to be drastically different by whether the pawn is on h5 or on h4 in this position. So after bishop d3, it makes sense that with black having a very strong sniper from h7, looking at the queen side from afar, that white would like to trade off this bishop. We happily accept the exchange. Bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, and now we play the flexible move of e6. And so what is our plan in this position as black? There are a few different plans we can follow, but the best one, in my opinion, is after a move like bishop to a2, bishop to d2, we can play the move knight g to f6 and simply develop our king side very solidly with bishop e7, with the ideas of castling short. Now, there is a lot more theory, of course, from these positions, but this is not a video aimed at especially advanced players. Of course, if you do want to enjoy more of my videos, do make sure to smash that like button and consider subscribing to the channel, especially if you're new here. So the plan for black is going to be to basically play c5 and then challenge the opponent's center, because if we can trade off the d4 pawn for the c6 pawn, it means that black is going to be the only one with a pawn in the center, in the pawn on e6. We trade off white's central space advantage, and also to trade those pawns is going to open up the c file for the rook, which can give us some potential counterplay against the white king. There are other plans that you also see, but c5 is basically the fundamental break in these pawn structures that already when you get to, in fact, this position here, we're already thinking in terms of how can we position our pieces on the right squares like we've seen before, and then prepare the c5 break accordingly. Now, one thing I want to show you is that the Caro-Kann is actually a very flexible opening. It can actually be played in quite a few different ways, and I want to show one more approach for those of you who maybe want to play something a little bit more maybe dynamic or a little bit more direct. Then you might like the move of knight to f6 and this Korchnoi variation, where when white takes the knight on f6 so as to avoid a loss of time defending the knight or retreating the knight, well, what way would you take back on f6 in this position if you were black? You can always let me know in the comments what your answers would be to my questions. That way you can always compare it with my thoughts and it will help you improve your chess faster. So my choice here would be to play e takes f6. And yeah, you are accepting doubled pawns. That might seem like a weakness, especially when in theory white's queenside majority looks a lot healthier than black's kingside majority, because white's majority can be used in theory to create a passed pawn with c4 and d5 in an endgame, whereas black's doubled pawns on the kingside are not going to be easily usable for creating a passed pawn on the kingside in an endgame. However, we're not in an endgame at the moment. We're still in a middle game with pieces on the board, and the move ef6, recapturing away from the center, has actually allowed black to develop his pieces much more quickly. So after moves such as c3, building a nice solid pawn chain, we would play the move bishop to d6, just developing our kingside as quickly as possible. Of course, d6 being the most active square for our bishop on a nice open diagonal. White does the same with bishop to d3. Castles kingside, getting the king castle to safety, and also preparing the move rook to e8, which after queen to c2, attacking this pawn on h7 with the battery of the queen and the bishop, while we can throw in the move rook e8 because that's a check to the king. And now after knight to e2, there's this quite modern approach that became rather popular in about the last 3 years or so, at least at the time that I'm recording this video in 2021, and that is to play this move h5. Now, at first glance, the move h5 might seem like a very weakening move in this position. Like, Max, aren't you just moving the pawns in front of your king and creating a weakness? But it's actually not all that simple, because if white were to castle short, we could go h4, bring our knight around to f8, and we'll actually even have some ideas of creating an attack against the h2 pawn by lining up the queen and the bishop. Of course, there is a lot more theory than this to the position that has developed, but I also want to show you what happens if white were to castle long and try to use that weakness that's supposedly been created with the move h5. So let's say that white plays a move like bishop e3, and after knight d7, white now decides to castle long instead, saying that, well, I'm just going to go h3, g4, and just rip open the black king. But here we see that the double pawns on f7 and f6 actually give black a total of 4 pawns defending the king, compared, let's say, to white's 3 pawns that are defending the king on the queen side. And so that gives black a certain insurance and protection against the coming white attack. It means that we can play the move knight to f8, where you might know the saying of the great Danish grandmaster Bent Larsen, one of the very best players of the late 1960s and early 1970s, that with a knight on f8, there can never be mate. And so at knight f8, we're covering the king side, and if white were to go, let's say, king b1, the bishop develops to e6, and already we can think about moves like queen a5 and trying to create some threats with the pieces against the white king. If white tries to anticipate that with the move of c4, for example, well, in this case, after c4, that also can create a potential hook for an attack. For those who don't know, a hook is where we attack the opponent's pawn with one of our own pawns in order to force open lines, usually to the opponent's king, but sometimes just to open up the position in general. And we see that here with the move rook c8, which is a preparatory move for the main break that black is going to play here to open up the white queen side. If you haven't figured it out, then I guess the customary severe chess-based lag is going to give you the opportunity to do so. So, come on, let me play my move rook c8. There we go. And so black is now ready to play, let's say if white just goes h3 and tries to get in this g4 break at any price, as such, even trying to sacrifice the pawn to open the files to the black king. Well, we can use a little bit of that magic as well here. And it turns out that the move b5 is actually quite a good move, both on a strategic level and on a tactical level. Because if white were to play c takes b5, we'll take it back with c takes b5. And just to test your guys' visualization skill a little bit, what's going to happen is you're actually going to be discovering an attack on the black queen with the rook, once those c-pawns are out of the way. And so we can see the value of putting our rook opposite the opponent's queen, because you never know when the position is suddenly going to open up with some pawn exchanges that allow you to, well, to attack the queen all of a sudden. We can see that white's done the same thing actually with his rook on d1 facing the queen on d5. It's a somewhat underestimated opening or middle game principle that can definitely help you if you're not sure where to put your rooks. Then putting your rook opposite the opponent's queen will give you often some tactical chances later in the game. And if white tries to instead keep the queen side closed with c5, well, yeah, on the one hand, he's managed to hold off the attack on the queen side, but it's come at the price of giving a very beautiful square on d5 for example, the black bishop, where white's queenside majority is now not really very mobile or very flexible. And if white did play a move like g4, trying to open the kingside, well, we can just keep it close with the move h4. White still has created some weaknesses in his structure, and it's definitely a position, while it's objectively equal, there's also a lot of scope for black to outplay white by exploiting the weaknesses that have been created as a result of white's very zealous play. So that's basically the story of how the knight f6 variation plays out. I know it's one of these lines that are a little bit more advanced than the bishop f5 setup. It takes a little more time to get your head around, which is why I've taken the time to explain the ideas very clearly so you understand why it is that black is playing h5 in this position on move 9 as we see here. So I think that makes sense to you guys. So let's now look at some other ways in which the opponent can counter our Caro-Kann. And I'm going to go back to the position after black's second move of d5. Just waiting for my chess-based program to bring up the position on the board. So there we go. Now, the next move I'm going to look at is one that's not the most common move at a higher level of play, but I find it to be the most common move if you're playing at, let's say, an 1800 level and below in online chess, that is on Lead Chess or chess.com or chess24, or maybe you play on some other server, but these are the big three. That is the exchange variation where e takes d5. Now, one thing to keep in mind with the Caro-Kann is that it's only the fourth most common move for black in this position, after, of course, c5, e5, and pawn to e6. So that means that your opponents are probably not going to be anywhere near as well prepared for the Caro-Kann as they would be, let's say, for one of the absolute mainline defenses to 1e4. That being said, the Caro-Kann still has a very good theoretical reputation, so it allows us to have that practical advantage of getting the opponent into something where they're not so familiar and where we are comfortable, but without really sacrificing much in terms of the objective quality of our moves. So after ed5, cd5, there are a few different plans for white. If white were to play a move like knight f3, that could sometimes be considered a little bit inflexible, in that it might give us the option to pin the knight with a bishop g4 move at a later stage. Not immediately, but perhaps after developing with knight c6 and so forth. For that reason, a more critical continuation for white is to try to make it hard for black's bishop to get outside the pawn chain, because the main idea of the Caro-Kann and playing 1c6 instead of 1e6, as we kind of saw in the knight c3 lines before, is that we want to develop our bishop outside the pawn chain and only then develop our kingside with the move e6. So with the move bishop d3 and then after knight c6, the move of c3, building this pawn chain, well, we see the main strategic problem black faces is that he has a bit of a hard time getting his c8 bishop outside the pawn chain because, well, at this stage, the f5 and g4 squares are both covered by the white pieces. So for that reason, one move that's actually quite a flexible one, and I think that this move is quite a effective choice, especially if you're playing at a club level, which I think that most of you watching this video up to playing on a more casual online or maybe playing in your local chess club. Well, the move queen to c7 is, I think, quite a tricky move to deal with, because what a lot of your opponents are going to do at a lower level is they're just going to play a move like knight to f3 and just develop normally, because with queen c7 we stop their bishop developing to a very nice active diagonal on f4, which of course would be the most active diagonal for that dark squared bishop. Those of you who played the London system as white might notice the similarities to the London if white could get in that bishop f4 move. But now after knight f3 we can pin the knight with bishop g4. And now do you recognize what opening this very closely resembles now, but with colors reversed? Yeah, well done if you realize that we actually have essentially a Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation. So that's an opening to rise after 1 d4, d5, c4, and e6. And it's a line where the extra tempo, I think, is not really going to help white so much. And the reason is that normally in the Queen's Gambit decline, that white bishop is on e2. So it's breaking that pin on the knight and allowing white often to put that knight on e5 later and try to get counterplay in that way. But because the knight is pinned, that's not really going to happen. So now I just want to show you how the pieces would typically develop from here, because I understand not every single one of you maybe plays the exchange Queen's Gambit declined with white, but it turns out to be a pretty easy system that we put our bishop on d6. Already we're threatening to win a pawn with bishop takes h2 because of the pin on the knight. So white usually goes h3 to deal with that. Bishop h5, rook e1. And now you actually have a choice where you can play more positionally with knight f6 and castles and go for the minority attack, rook b8, b5, b4. Those who are very strategically inclined players probably will prefer this kind of approach. The one that I like personally is to put the knight on e7, which I consider to be just a little bit more flexible here. And I think that already this position is a little bit more pleasant for black, where we are going to castle our king with a later castles. We can still play the minority attack plan if we want to, but depending on how they position our pieces, we might also have moves like e5 trying to play in the center, though it's going to be very situational whether that move's a good idea or not. It tends to work better if white has already moved the knight away from f1, then e5 might gain a little more in strength in that case as a little advanced principle. Because then after e5, d5, knight e5, it's, kind of helps if that knight on f3 is not defended by its buddy on d2 against the pin. Okay, it is true that white can play better, and certainly more advanced players will want to know how to deal with moves like knight to e2 and h3 as well. For now, I'll point out that the plan of going for e5 and playing for an isolated queen's pawn position will allow black to more or less achieve equality. You could argue that practically it's a bit easier to play white, but black's position is very much playable here. So, the next line I want to share is one that leads to a much more open position by comparison, and this is going to be our fourth variation actually that I'll be sharing, as my chess base just froze on me, but we're all good now. So that line is known as the Panov-Botvinnik attack with the move 4 to c4. And the move 4 c4, well, white's idea is in some ways similar to the Alep and Sicilian with e4, c5 and the move c3 for those of you guys who are familiar with this opening. If you're not familiar with it, the reason I draw this comparison is because when you've got this tension between the pawns on c4 and d5, say we play knight f6 and knight c3, well, we can see that it's very likely that the pawns on c4 and d5 are going to be traded, and in that case, that's going to leave white with an isolated queen's pawn, or IQP for short, on d4, and that can be both a blessing and a burden for white. On the one hand, that pawn on d4 does give white a little bit of a space advantage. On the other hand, it also means that, well, by the same token, that pawn is isolated and is going to be, well, it can only be defended by the pieces. There's not another pawn for white that can defend it. So it means that if white is not able to create threats and keep the momentum, then black could very well be the one taking control of the game later on a strategic level. Now in this position, there are quite a few different moves that black can play. The main moves here are the moves knight to c6, which I would say is probably the most reliable equalizer. The move e6, which is a lot more old school as such. And then there's the move that is going to be my recommendation as a very interesting shortcut, and one I think that if your opponent is not prepared for it, you can very quickly get a super comfortable position. And that's the move of g6, which is basically working, you could say by analogy to the Tarrasch variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. If you're not sure of the comparison, let's say if it was black to move in this position instead of white, then we would have exactly the same position as the Tarrasch Queen's Gambit declined, as it were. And it's true, white with the extra tempo, he can try to use that in different ways, and probably queen b3 and trying to grab the extra pawn is probably the best way to do so. It turns out we do get good compensation for the pawn there though. I should also point out, by the way, that if white does develop normally, that we will just go bishop g7, castles, knight to c6, and often you'll have moves like bishop g4. And it is going to put a lot of pressure against that pawn on d4, and that gives black a very pleasant position. So that's why it's kind of important for white to go queen b3 and try to win this pawn on d5 if he wants to fight for an opening advantage. But it turns out after bishop g7 that we, instead of taking on c4 and letting white get a big lead in development with bishop takes c4 and attacking f7, we can simply sacrifice the pawn, realizing that after c takes d5, and now the move of castles, as I wait for ChessBase to finally let me play these moves on the board. There we go, cd5 castles. Well, we see that the white extra pawn is doubled, so that greatly decreases the value of the extra pawn as such. And we have different ideas to try to regain this pawn. One possibility, for example, is to play a move like knight d7 to b6 and try to regain the pawn that way. That's why at a higher level, white will usually play the move bishop e2 so that he can defend this pawn with bishop to f3. But in that case, you can still play the move knight b to d7 if you want to. There are other good approaches as well, but this one definitely is quite a natural one, where you go knight to b6, and then if knight g2, and they try to defend airing with knight f4, well then there are different plans at black's disposal. Probably the easiest one is just to go bishop to g4, trading off that strong bishop on f3, and then bringing a knight back to hit the pawn. And it's going to take some time. I mean, it is a position where, to be fair, white does have some small chances for an advantage going for moves like a4 and a5, but we can still play moves like knight f6, queen d7, keep the pressure on the d5 pawn, and it just ends up being very, very hard for white to really use his extra pawn in a meaningful way. So I think that as a worst case scenario, this is a perfectly reasonable system for black. And the reason I've chosen to recommend this is not because it's the best line for black objectively. There are more reliable equalizers. But I find that this g6 approach is one that if you're playing against players below 2000, it's very unlikely they're going to find moves like queen to b3 or moves like 8 bishop e2, which are already quite sort of unnatural moves if you don't know that they're theory beforehand. It's more likely your opponent's going to just develop normally like knight f3, bishop e2, and just allow you to get good pressure against the d4 pawn with very natural developing moves. So that's why I recommend g6 against the Panov-Botvinnik attack. And we've gone through 4 variations so far, so let's keep going. And now I'm going to share the line that I do consider to be the most critical one in the against the Caro-Kann, and that is the advanced variation with the move 3 to e5. Now, with the move 3 to e5, there are certainly some comparisons to be drawn with the advanced French, where black would have the pawn on e6 rather than the pawn on c6. And I have to admit that the version for the Caro-Kann is one that is, I think, slightly worse compared to the version in the advanced French. And the reason is that in these sort of positions, black would love to play the c5 break. That's basically black's primary break to undermine the white center and challenge the space advantage, kind of like we saw in the free knight c3 lines beforehand. But we can see here that the move c5 will now take an extra tempo, where here we would have the same position as in a French defense advance, but where the pawn is on e7 rather than being on e6. It's worth pointing out that even though this is a pawn sacrifice, that white can play the move d takes c5 here, that this is actually quite a replayable way to handle the position. And the reason for that is that basically if white does play the move d takes c5, well, in that case we have the move of e6 anyway, and because white has released the tension in the center, it means if we can take back that pawn, it is going to give us a nice central majority to work with. Of course, this is not the end of the story. There are ways in which white can play where he can give back the pawn on c5 and say that that extra tempo spent on c5 makes up for the fact that white released the tension in the center. That's definitely something that if you're an advanced player watching this, you will want to explore this a lot more deeply in your own time and be very well prepared here, because these lines like a3 and knight f3 are quite trendy. But if you are playing this at a club level, it's much more likely that your opponent is going to try to defend this extra pawn in some way. Now, a move like b4 is just going to run into moves like a5 and b6, which has allowed black to very easily undermine the white pawn structure and regain the pawn in that way. There are a few tactical complications, but you can take my word for it that it does work out for black. So the move bishop e3 is a much more flexible way to defend this pawn. But then we get some other options at our disposal. For example, the move knight d7 is a nice way to attack both the e5 pawn and the c5 pawn, so that if white wants to keep his extra pawn, he more or less has to go for the move bishop to b5, pinning the knight. And, well, our compensation partly rests in the fact that white does have both these e5 and c5 pawns that are coming under fire, and white will have to make some concessions in order to keep the extra pawn. So after bishop b5, we just develop normally with knight e7. I do admit that this is one of the more advanced lines that I'm covering in this video. And if white were to play a move such as, let's say, knight to f3 here, trying to defend that pawn on e5, just waiting for chess space to finally allow me to play this this knight to f3 move. There we go. Well, in that case, there are a couple of options that black can play. You can either play a move like knight f5, a move like a6 first is also possible. But let's go with knight f5 and attack the pawn, the bishop on e3, so that we can regain our pawn with bishop takes c5. In turn, white is usually going to try to keep that extra pawn alive in some way. For example, he could try a move such as bishop to d4, which is the most common move in practice, trying to keep this sort of bishop alive without allowing the pawns to be doubled if black were to take it. But it turns out bishop d4 is a move we're actually very happy to see, because then we can play a very annoying move. I want to see if you guys can find it, so you can always pause the video if you need more time to think about it. And that's the move of queen to a5. And the idea of queen a5 is that with the fork on the bishop and on the king, that forces white to play knight c3. But then we can play the move a6, breaking the pin on the knight, so that after takes and then the recapture on d7, as you can see here. Well, in that case, black is just simply going to regain the pawn with knight takes d4, bishop takes c5 after that. That will give black a very nice bishop pair advantage to work with, and black is just very, very comfortable in that case. So the move c5, it's a reasonable shortcut, and it's something that I think if you want to set the maximum practical problems for your opponent, maybe surprise them a little bit, I think that the c5 line is a line that will allow you to do so. On the other hand, if you want to play maybe something a little bit more straightforward in it, there are somewhat less forcing variations that you need to know, or lines, let's say, where you can play a little more systematically, then I would suggest the move bishop f5 as being maybe the approach that you would prefer. And this is in fact the classical main line for black in order to develop the bishop outside the pawn chain, so that after knight f3 that black can subsequently play the move of e6 without that bishop being shut in on c8 as it would be in the French defense. So e6. White's main line is known as the short system with bishop to e2. And the good news is that there are a lot of playable systems that black can play here. So I think it's going to be very easy for you to find something that does suit your style. On the other hand, it is also true that this is a main line and white will have chances for an advantage whatever line we play. But personally, I have a soft spot for the move of c5. It's one of these very direct moves that I think that, again, if you're playing this at a club level, that your opponents are not going to be very well prepared, that they might play some quiet move like c3 that will sort of allow you to go knight c6, put your knight on f5, and just get this very nice pressure against the pawn on d4, where in that case we would have a good version of an advanced French, where our bishop is a lot more active on f5 than it would be on c8, and that sort of makes up for the 2 tempi that it took us to get in the vital c5 break. But it's worth pointing out that white can play more critically, that the move bishop to e3 is a move that is quite dangerous. White does have a lead in development, and the center is going to open up soon with the tension between the pawns. So we should be quite careful here as black, and my suggestion then is to play the move of queen to b6. And this can lead to some quite sharp fury, so it is a line where you definitely should be prepared. But it's also a line that I find is mostly played at the IM and Grandmaster level. So if you're playing as a club level, I think that your opponent is not going to be very well versed in these lines. And if they do know this move at knight c3, which is really the only move for white to fight for any kind of advantage, well, we can just go knight c6, keeping the tension against the center. It turns out that the pawn grab on b2 is a little bit too risky when you haven't developed enough of your pieces. I'm not going to go into all the details, but you can take my word for it. But then after the move castles here, well, there's some very sharp fury at this stage, where after a short castle, it turns out you can actually then safely grab that pawn on b2. I know it looks risky, but it actually turns out alright. And if you don't take, you end up kind of a bit behind in development, because already white has to find some difficult moves. Like, for example, the theoretical move for white of queen to e1 here, defending the knight and preparing rook b1. That's not an easy move to see whatsoever if you're not aware that this is a theoretical move beforehand. And then after the move of queen to e1, as I just wait for chess-base to play it on the board, well, in that case, there's some long theory that starts with, the move c takes d4 here. And then after the move of knight takes d4 in reply, or I should say bishop takes d4 rather than the knight takes d4. Come on, let me play the move already. So after c takes d4, they play the move bishop takes d4, which is aimed against bishop b4 pins, which are going to be quite unpleasant for white, as we will see. So after the move bishop takes d4, we take the bishop, knight takes d4, and then when they take back, we're going to play the move of bishop to b4 from there. And that's going to basically, thanks to the pin, give us sufficient counterplay where there is a lot more fury at a high level, but I think this is enough for you to see that black is up a pawn. He's managed to still keep the fight for the initiative, and the position ultimately ends up being very reasonable for black from there. And I want to show it on the board, but my chess base is unfortunately freezing quite a lot, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to do more of these videos while chess base is just completely, you know, trolling me like this. Yeah, you can see already, like, it's goes a little bit crazy when it lags for a whole minute in this way. Like, I tried using, like, the fixes I mentioned in an earlier video, like the Stockfish, you know, how Stockfish murdered me video, but it looks like it's still murdering me again, even after I applied all the fixes, so what to do. In any case, if this line is too sharp for your taste, it's worth pointing out you can also play moves like knight d7 and knight to e7 and play much more slowly. For example, one plan that you'll see in some positions from there is to play like h6, bishop h7, knight f5, bishop e7, and kind of get your king castle in that sort of way. That's definitely also a reasonable setup if you want less hand-to-hand combat and a more strategic type of battle. But I'm not going to delve into that there because, after all, I only have 10 variations to show you the key ideas. And, well, basically the point is to make sure that all the important moves for white are covered as well as for black. So it's worth pointing out that white is not limited to the move of knight to f3. It does have some alternative approaches as well. And most of them can be met in a fairly similar way to what we've seen, but there are some exceptions. The most prominent one is probably the Tal variation with the move of h4 at this point. And the idea of h4 is basically aimed against the move e6, because that would allow g4 and it would turn out your bishop would actually be trapped and lost by force in the style of the Noah's Ark's trap. So that's definitely something that you guys will want to avoid. Fortunately, now that we know what's coming, it's pretty easy to avoid this possibility. And the way that we do that is we can simply play the move h5 and just stop this g4 idea altogether. There are a few different moves that white can play. You know, obviously, there's quite a sharp theoretical sort of line, but I'm just going to give like basically the old main line as sort of the kind of starting point. Or actually, you know what? I'm going to show the move bishop to d3. I think this move is maybe the more difficult one to deal with if you aren't fully prepared. So the idea is that when you've thrown in the moves h4, h5, that white has managed to secure the g5 square for the bishop. So that's why the normally unfavorable trade, the light squared bishops for white, actually ends up being quite reasonable for him here. Now, I think that a reasonable shortcut for black is to play the move of queen to a5 at this point, which is not as common as the move of e6, but it was recommended by Vidit in one of his chess-based DVDs on the Caro-Kann. And the idea is that after knight to d2, well, we can always just play some move like e6. And then the idea of playing queen a5 is that later we are going to play a move like queen a6 and offer an exchange of queens, keeping in mind that when white has a space advantage, that the exchange of pieces is in principle going to be in black's favor. From there, you can play moves like knight to e7, put an eye on f5 and attack d4 and h4 that way. Or you can play for moves like c5 and knight c6 and pressure the pawn on d4 if white were to play a little bit passively and not, you know, get in a c4 break in time. So all in all, this line is definitely quite reasonable for black. You know, black is definitely very solid at this moment. And because of the queen a5 check, we avoided some tricky gambit lines that can happen with an early bishop to g5. So that reduces our workload just a little bit. So now that we've looked at these lines, we can now start to look at some relative sidelines that maybe you're not going to face as often as the lines that I've shown you, but which can be a little bit tricky to deal with if you're not prepared for them. So let's make sure we're prepared. The eighth variation I want to share with you is the fantasy variation with f3. And this is a move that actually I remember recently was used by Maxime Vacher-Lagrave to beat Kirill Alexienko. That's something that actually I did a video on YouTube earlier, so I'll make sure to put that in the suggestion as well. So after f3, I think that there are quite a few approaches for black that are quite playable. Probably the most solid one is the move of e6 and just transitioning into a French defense where these move f3 is not so useful for white and c6 is not so useful for black by comparison. From there, you can play it in a winnower style with bishop to b4. And I think that then a setup along the lines of something like knight to e7, castles, and then playing like b6 and thinking about the c5 break, it's going to give black quite reasonable play. I will point out that in fairness, if you are willing to put in a bit more work, then the move queen b6 with the idea of going for an e5 gambit to take the initiative in the center, This is a line I think is the most unpleasant for white, but it does require a little bit more sort of study to kind of make sense of those positions in a way. Like it's not, let's say, as straightforward, but I mention as an alternative for those who are a little bit more advanced and are willing to play a little more aggressively and sort of not give any sort of concession to white. So that's the 8th variation, which was a bit of a shorter one, but let's have a look at some of white's alternatives to d4. Now, if white were to play a move like c4, it's going to lead to very similar play to the Panov Botvinnik after d5. It's known as the pseudo Panov, so you can kind of play this more or less the same setup that I showed there. Like if they delay 1d, d4, the same setup of g6, bishop g7 is still going to work in those positions. So you don't really have anything to worry about there. By contrast, I think that the two knights with knight c3, d5, and knight f3 is a system that does deserve some respect from us. The good news is that we can actually play an improved version of the knight f6 setup that I showed against the free knight c3 line at the start of the video. So that is, we can play the move d takes e4, knight takes e4, and then the move knight to f6. And the reason it's a better version is because in the line, if they play knight f6, ef6, it turns out that the knight on f3 is not as well placed there compared to e2. And the reason is that you're going to have a bishop to g4 pin on the knight, which will be a little bit hard for white to get out of, and that will just give us very comfortable piece play, which will fully compensate for the doubled e-pawns. That's the reason why at a higher level the move queen e2 is considered more critical, and it is a line where it definitely should be well prepared as black. Fortunately, the move knight takes e4 is a pretty good counter, where we are using the fact that the white queen will be in the center, and therefore can be an object of attack for us. And from there, I quite like the idea of playing the move queen to a5. And queen a5 is sort of a multi-purpose move in that we are preparing to move bishop to f5, attacking the queen, and of course if white were to allow this move with a gain of tempo, we could then play like e6, knight d7 after that, and just play like normal Caro-Kann developing moves for a very healthy game, where white has not even managed to get a good d4 push yet. But if white tries to anticipate that with a move such as queen to f4, well, then we have the move queen f5 that will basically equalize, because if they try to avoid the swap of queens, we can actually safely grab that pawn on c2, and white gets compensation, but not really enough for an advantage. Or if they do decide to accept the trade of queens with d3, we can just take, and basically, in this case, well, we see that this ending is absolutely fine for black. You can even play a little ambitiously, where move like f6 and just play to take the center with e5. And, once you have that central space, there's no way at all that you are worse in such a position. They can play d4, but that allows bishop f5, and again, you get a very comfortable Caro-Kann endgame. One principle to keep in mind is that in general, endgames are quite pleasant for black in the Caro-Kann, because it takes all of the sting out of white's space advantage, and it means that some of the weaknesses that white might create in a pawn structure, well, may prove to be more of a factor as more pieces get traded off the board, which is especially true in the lines where white put the pawn on h5. So it's a good long-term principle to keep in mind. If for some reason like this line with a double e-pawn, you just don't like it at all, I will point out that bishop g4 is also a good alternative, with the idea of eventually playing h3, bishop f3, kind of trading away your bishop pair, but putting your pawns on light squares to kind of counteract their light squared bishop. It's a legitimate approach as well, but of course this is not the place to show every single line in detail, but just to paint a general picture of how you can approach the positions and how to deal with white's most important tries. So for the final variation I'm going to look at, I'm going to cover the King's Indian attack setup with d3. And actually in recent times, the move of knight f3 has been quite a trendy move for white, just playing to not let black get in an easy e5 push. On the other hand, it does allow black to play d takes e4 and to trade the queens to get an ending that is a little more pleasant for white, but black should be able to equalize if he plays it precisely. But knight f3, it is true, this is a very advanced move. I think that 99% of you guys watching this are not going to face this move from a prepared opponent, but advanced players, you definitely want to make sure you're ready for this. But more commonly, white has historically played the move of knight d2. And the reason knight d2 is a bit less critical than knight f3 is it allows us to take control of the center by playing the move pawn to e5. And then if they attack the pawn with knight f3, we simply defend it with a move bishop d6, and we're going to play a setup that's known as the Geller system when white plays it, where we just build this very solid center with the pawns on e5, d5, and c6, and then develop the pieces behind our space advantage. So for example, the most common move for white here is the move of g3, Yeah, white can play d4 as well, but objectively those positions are also fine for black. But g3 kind of gives us what we want to some extent, because we can develop normally with moves like knight to f6, as I wait for this move to be played on the board. White goes bishop g2, and we see both sides are developing their pieces normally. But what we can also observe here is that the bishop on g2 is actually very passive at the moment, because it's stuck behind this pawn on e4 that right now is not really going anywhere. I mean, you don't really want to open the diagonal of ed5, because then you're just giving black a central majority with c takes d5. Now the most common move for black in practice is the move rook e8. Just a very flexible move where you can bring your knight to d7, sometimes the knight can maneuver around in this way, or just sit on d7. In terms of a general plan, let's see a few more moves. So rook e1, knight bd7, let's say white plays a move like c3. Well, in that case, I like the move of a5, where we're just making sure not to give white any easy kind of pawn break, so we're not letting him get in a move like b4 and grab space on the queen side, for example. And if they play something like queen to c2, just trying to develop normally, we can sort of see here that even though white's playing very natural moves, that because black has more space, that as the game goes on, black is actually going to be the one trying to get an advantage if white doesn't find some way to counteract that. I mean, if those of you are familiar with the Hanham-Philidor lines, well, it's kind of similar in spirit to that, except with the bishop being on g2 for white instead of e2. And, well, in this case, some different plans for black can be moves like queen to c7, is a good square for the queen to defend e5. You're often going to have moves like a4 or even b5, just grabbing space on the queen side. So it's a very flexible position where your plan is kind of going to adapt depending on how white plays it. For example, if white maybe doesn't develop his pieces efficiently enough, you might have a good moment of being able to play d takes e4 later and then using your lead in development in that way. So you kind of just sort of play it by ear, and that's going to give you a small advantage. Of course, it's true that white could have also played a little bit better. For example, the move of d4 is probably the move that white should play here if he wants to maintain the balance, but like I said, not a critical continuation for us. So yeah, with that, I know that this was a bit of a long video, so congratulations guys on getting to the end of it. Do make sure to hit that like button so I know to make more videos like this, and also consider subscribing to the channel, especially if you are new here. So yeah, with that being said, well, good luck with playing the Caro-Kann in your games. I trust that with these 10 fully explained variations that I've shown you, that it's going to be very easy for you to remember these key ideas and to implement them in your own games. And if, let's say, you do forget in a game, well, this video is always here that you can revise and watch later to make sure that you got all the key ideas down. Alright guys, take care and good luck with this Caro-Kann opening. Get out of here.